fintech investment platforms. Not just that, he is a prominent technology entrepreneur. Also, he has become one of Nigeria's fastest growing fintech companies, which has over 400,000 users and more than 300 billion naira in transaction value within 4 years. The firm operates through a multi structured approach encompassing brokerage, investment advisory, and real estate. Mr. Oluwatomi holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Lagos. Also, he's a fellow of the Young African Leaders Initiative, EcoBank Fintech, and was recognized as a Jackma Foundation 2022 African Business Hero and a Leap Africa 2018 Social Innovator. Not just that, he has a decade of experience in nurturing technology startups. He's passionate about giving back, serving as a volunteer with the Red Cross and Lagos Food Bank. Also, he mentors through the Tony Elumelu's Foundation's Founders Institute, Mass Challenge, and Rice University. He's a technology enthusiast. Also, he enjoys new technologies, gadgets, and startups. When he's not immersed in tech, he can be found binge watching Netflix or planning his next travel adventure. Mr. Luwatomi, welcome to the FinTech Africa podcast. We are glad to have you on board.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Right. So I would like you to tell us just a bit about the topic. Tell us, what motivated you to first enter the fintech space? And also, what motivated you to specifically focus on the area of investment and wealth management in Africa?
Yeah. Thanks, Margaret. And thanks everyone for the invite. Really good to be here. So straight to the questions, just in case, in terms of motivations, I've really been in tech for quite a bit of time, but specifically fintech. I believe, like, my thesis is that Africa has immense untapped potential. I think financial services is the anchor upon which a lot of other things rely on. So if you think about, edutech or education, right, they still need to process payments. There are so many things that sit under, education type platforms that still rely on, financial technology products, whether it's an API or whether it's a product that's kind of, in some shape or form integrated. But outside of that, so across all different facets of life, right, facets of life, there's still a financial services underlayer in all of these things. So it was, a very really massive market, really important market. But outside of that, I think from the finance perspective, why I specifically focused on investing is, traditional financial markets have left many people without access to investment opportunities. Africa is also one of the most unequal continents in the world with regards to, wealth. And so for us, technology offers a way to change it and to empower people. And we're just doing our own bits in, providing access and democratizing wealth building.
That's right. Thank you. So, you mentioned Africa just slightly. I would like you to share brief with us. What do you think are unique challenges and opportunities that Africa presents in the context of democratizing investments through fintech?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, like, one is we still have a long way to go on the continent. It's a massive continent, a billion plus people on the continent. So Africa is right now probably 15-20% of the entire world. And when you think about it, when you see statistics, in the coming over the next decade, over the next century, Africa will play even a more important role, right? In terms of, like, the youth population, Africa will have, by far, by leaps and bounds, the highest youth population in the world. And when I even say the highest, is not no continent comes close to that. In fact, every other continent has declining youth population. So I think, there's a massive opportunity on the African continent. It's also a very nascent market, so we are still very early in our own, development. And outside of just the population, the infrastructure, there's a lot of opportunity with infrastructure, building things, a lot of things that are available in the West that are just beginning to come, to Africa. So there's a lot of opportunity to build infrastructure in Africa. There's a lot of opportunity to build wealth. Also, financial literacy is really low in on the African continent. There's a challenge there too as well. But like I said, the opportunities are huge, right? Mobile penetration in Africa is high. The population, like I said earlier, is also young. And we're not just young, we're ready, to embrace like new financial tools. So lots of challenges, but at the same time, massive opportunity.
Thank you for that. So I would like you to also share some light, like provide an overview for us of how fintech is currently shaping the investment landscape in Africa at the moment.
Yeah, so it's a lot of things. I think one key thing that just comes to mind now, the first thing that comes to mind is like bridging the gap. Um, Fintechs, they provide like mobile based solutions that pretty much bypass like traditional bank barriers. So because of fintech, right, a platform like ours, which is like Trove, which pretty much democratized access to financial markets, in the sense that prior to us doing this thing, in fact, large investment banks, large asset managers, broker dealers, nobody had hacked it, right? But we're able to take an idea and then build technology at the heart of that idea, and we're able to reach people that ordinarily traditional financial institutions could not reach. So yeah, like the ability to bypass traditional bank barriers, you can offer financial services to the underserved through apps and online platforms. So with somebody having just signal, right, and a cell phone, they can start to access services that were in times past or historically only available to people that were rich or people that were middle class, upper middle class. But now everybody has access to that. Tying closely to that point is accessibility, right? So platforms like whether it's like a Trove or whether it's like a Money Point or whether it's like a Paystack or what technology platforms in general enable like small, regular um whether it's the regular debits or whether it's regular investing. Um, it reduces barriers. Fintech reduces barriers, and yeah, I think within the context of investing, like I said earlier, I think the big thing is just just providing access to things that ordinarily the underserved or people without huge amounts of money um, they can now partake in those things.
Right, thank you. So you mentioned some interesting words actually. You mentioned accessibility, reducing barriers. So I'd like you to shed some more light. Tell us about successful examples based on your experience, which fintech solutions have effectively democratized investments in Africa.
Okay, I think there are lots of examples beyond investing, but like if I were to just focus on investing, um, a platform like Trove is an obvious example. There are also other investment platforms too as well, like Bamboo. Um, Outside of Nigeria too as well, there are platforms like Hisa in Kenya. There are platforms like Easy Equities in South Africa. What all of these different platforms did, right, is pretty much take like a legacy product or legacy service. And what I mean by legacy is something that has existed for a long time. And what these platforms then did is bake like interesting or very beautiful user experience and user interface, and pretty much just simplify the entire process around um, investing, savings and all of these things. In Nigeria too, for example, there are apps like PiggyVest too as well. That prior to those, that platform existing, people would historically go to a bank, leave their money in a savings account, or even when they fix their funds in a bank. And what you would do is you are getting, cobbles on the naira on your naira, right? So you put money, and like instead of your money to grow, your money is getting wiped out by fees and all of that stuff, right? So but like platforms like, all of these ones I mentioned, like, Trove Inclusive, which is the one that I run, have fixed that challenge, right? Where you used to have, or you needed to have $5,000 to invest in an Amazon, right? You could do it with, $10, right? Or where you needed, or where you were going to put money in the bank. For example, you put 100,000, 50,000, 20,000, whatever it is in the bank, and then you get wiped out due to like bank charges. Platform like ours, and some of the other ones I mentioned too as well, pay you instead of wiping you out, right? So you then start to get 20% yield, 25% yield, 15% yield, as opposed to like a lot of savings accounts with like financial institutions like banks and all of that stuff that probably will give you 1%, 2%, 3%, maybe max 5%, but then collect that 5% back in the form of charges. And like it's very easy. You don't need to walk into any bank branch. In terms of KYC, most times you don't need to fill any forms, right? So yeah.
Thank you for that. So you initially mentioned simplification in your earlier submission, but now we would all agree that in as much as fintech firms have done a lot, there's still a lot of there are a lot of people out there who still don't have access to investment platforms. Is either they are not literate enough to gain access, or there's a lot of doubt surrounding it. So I'd like you to throw some light how fintech platforms are addressing the challenge of financial inclusion in rural areas where access to traditional banking is limited.
Um, Sorry, could you come? I think I missed that last part of the question.
Sure. So we are looking at how can fintech platforms address the challenge of financial inclusion in rural areas where access to traditional banking is limited.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for repeating that.
Welcome.
I think a couple of things, right? So I think like one is at the end of the day, everybody still relies on some type of traditional rails. But one thing that we can do, or one thing a lot of platforms are doing, is like ties back some of my earlier points, right? People are building simplified interfaces to appeal to a broader demographic of people. People are doing a lot of localization. So you go into a specific area, right? And the language that they speak there differs from um, what a place 20 kilometers away from that place speaks, right? So, people are, building simplified local languages. But outside of, all of these things on the product side, people are innovating with things like, mobile money, and partnering with like local agents, all right, to reach rural areas. So pretty much what that does is it helps you bypass the need for a physical bank branch, and it gives people direct access to financial products. So these days we see like POS people. There's like this proliferation of like POS people like everywhere. You literally go on one street, you see 50 POS people. And what that does essentially is there's some that have cash in, cash out models. There's some that allow, credit, debit cards. But for a cash in, cash out model is the agent can serve as some type of pseudo bank branch. Um, I can also like carry my ATM card and like take cash in and out, right? And so those kind of things outside of the product side, which I explained earlier, um, can help drive or bypass the need for physical bank branches, and pretty much get people slowly but surely into the financial system.
Right. So now all the steps you've mentioned, they are typically all innovative solutions which fintech companies are bringing out. However, we still have the issue of regulation and compliance. So what are some steps being taken to ensure that fintech companies actually comply with local regulations while still promoting innovation?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that a lot of regulators, and I speak very broadly just because of the audience, I like I speak broadly like across the continent. One trend I'm seeing is sandboxes. So a lot of regulators are introducing sandboxes to help like fintechs test their ideas in a very compliant way. Um, and another thing is, prior or before that, the whole process of getting a license, there was a huge bottleneck. It was a very complicated process, right? Because people don't even know, they didn't know how to go about it. Um, there are varying regulations across the African continent. Fintechs, or like financial technology companies, as they're popularly known to as well, are known to move fast and break things, because there's a lot of creativity. People are trying to do things that are not the norm, and sometimes the framework is not readily available there, right? So regulation was always the problem. It was always a problem, but sandboxes help. Um, and I think like a second thing is like compliance versus innovation, right? So fintechs collaborate with regulators to align with local laws, but at the same time, they still try to push for innovation to benefit the market. There are fintechs that were off like a regulator's radar, right? But because of the immense amount of scale that they were able to have, so historically, it was taking banks or some financial institutions 20 years, 15 years of existence to break 1 million users, 3 million users, 5 million users, right? With technology, you see, 3, 4 year old um, upstarts, right? Breaking the 1 million user mark, breaking the 5 million user mark. And I think moving forward, there will be more collaboration between fintechs and regulators to ensure both compliance and also the innovation side of things thrive. Um, yeah, I think I'll stop it at that for now.
Okay, thank you. So let's look a bit at investment products and services. Just shed some light. What type of investment products are currently being offered by fintech platforms, and how do they actually cater to the diverse needs of African investors?
Thanks, Margaret. I think a bunch of things. I think top of mind for me are stocks, um, which is like one of the most popular use cases for most investment platforms. But outside of stocks, we're seeing some interesting things around being done within the real estate, side too as well. So fractional real estate, where um, if you cannot buy a property, um, and those properties, range from, across um, different localities. So it's not like um, I I have to buy in Lagos or whatever. We're seeing platforms that fintechs that are coming and just aggregates like different supply of different properties across different markets. In fact, these days there are fintechs that allow people to invest in properties in London and in the US and in Nigeria and in scattered across the 36 states without you having to buy the property, right? So I think like the term here, they just call it, people call it fractional investing. So, outside of stocks, we're seeing a lot of interesting stuff going on like the real estate space too as well. But there's a lot of innovation on the fixed income side too as well. And by fixed income, I mean like anything that if I is technically what the term is, fixed and income. So if I those are products that pretty much I put 100,000 naira and they guarantee me, oh, you make 10%, 20% for 15 days, and they on the back end now investing government bonds or treasury bills or any of those things that you don't need to be bothered about, but guaranteed yield products. So there are some products too as well, like mutual funds, bonds, um, and these things cater to the needs of like both high income and low income investors. So what we are seeing is there's interest in all of these different things that I mentioned, but it has been done nowadays in such a way that irrespective of how much you make, there's no longer any excuse, right? So people with 1,000 naira, historically, before you could invest in a lot of top banks like their mutual funds historically, right? Or their fixed deposits. Some of them will tell you like, oh, you have to have 5 million in naira, or 10 million in naira, or if you enter to do a dollar investment, they'll tell you have to have a $50,000 minimum. But nowadays, right, technology products, 5,000 naira, you know $10, $15, like paltry, like very tiny sums of money. Um, we're seeing all of that happen. Um, but another interesting thing, like just to tie back, just before I wrap up that point, is um, we're seeing platforms use data to also personalize investment recommendations, right? Based on like user behavior, financial goals, risk tolerance. So we're seeing a lot of interesting stuff around data analytics too as well. So yeah, I think in terms of products, there's a huge range of things that people nowadays can invest in through all of these platforms. But at the same time, the interesting things around, I think, top of mind is data analytics, that is helping optimize to make sure that people even do better, right? If you invest yourself, like how do you pick the right thing, and what kind of thing is suitable for you? If you're a 60-year-old, for example, you're a 60 or 70-year-old, for example, right? Should you be investing in stocks, right? Um, I have a whole theory, a whole thesis around it. I have a whole, there are schools of thought that says, okay, you know what, if you are 70-year-old, like, or towards retirement, a huge, probably like 90% of your portfolio should be in safe things, right? Things that are not fluctuating. If you are younger, you should be more aggressive, right? Um, Things like stocks that go up and come down. A stock, for example, you can invest in a stock and it can go 1000x, right? There are lots of examples of stocks that people started out, they put $1 and they made $1,000, right? But at the same time, the problem with stocks too as well is it's very volatile. It goes up, comes down, goes up, comes down. You can make it $1 to $1,000 and it goes down to $500 and then it goes up to $5,000. Um, yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was a very detailed explanation. So we want to look at, I mean, when it comes to the future, we are seeing a lot happening and we know that more would happen in the future. But shed some light for us. What are some emerging trends in fintech that you believe will further democratize investment opportunities in Africa?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm always excited to talk about. Um, Now everybody's like AI to cook rice, AI to change my tires, AI to do everything. AI is going to kill the entire world and replace all our jobs, and we'll be jobless. But yeah, I think there's a lot of promise in AI. Um, Within the context of investment. Um, we're seeing a lot of interesting platforms come up around AI driven investment advice, right? So I think the beautiful thing about technology is before, historically, if I were a investment advisor or like a fund manager or any of those things, right? Or whatever people call them, financial analysts, people wrap all sorts of names. But essentially, if I were someone that used to work with clients to help them optimize for their financial growth, right? I will need to meet the person, talk to the person on the phone. I'll have a conversation, say, okay, yes, yeah, 30, let's plot a chart, or something progressive that says, okay, this is how much you will need to retire, and like all of those computations. And I have like constant conversations with you. Um, those are still very important, and they still have their own role. They'll still continue to play their role in the entire scheme of things, right? But what we are seeing these days is with AI, people can, go on apps, answer a couple of questions. The app, for example, will say, okay, are you an aggressive investor? Are you not aggressive? If you're an aggressive investor, perhaps it can take other data points and recommend stocks, for example, to you, right? Or recommend certain type of stocks to you or certain markets or stocks to you. If you're not an aggressive person, aggressive in the sense that by asking you a couple of questions, I already understand that. So if I ask you a question, for example, that the stock market lost 70% in one day, what are you going to do? And I put 3 or 4 variables. One of the variables is like I say, okay, number one, sell off everything I have. Number two, sell off 50% of what I have. Number three, keep everything. Some people call it YOLO. You only live once. I'm going to keep it and just continue, betting on the market coming up. By whatever you tick, is a bit of psychoanalysis. I can understand a bit of like who you are. So if you pick the third one, I know you're a risk taker. I know you are somebody that can stay the course. If you pick the first one, I know you're somebody that doesn't like risk. Immediately you smell like 1%, like, oh, there's small risk here. Yeah, yeah, you jackpot, you're gone. Right. So immediately, so based off of these questions, right, I can get a peek into your brain or how you're thinking. And AI does all of this, right? So it's a very interesting space. There are other like interesting use cases. Um, Outside of that, there are blockchain-based solutions, though those ones have not taken off as much as like AI. But that's very interesting on the enterprise side. Um, and yeah, I think like platforms like ours that provide democratized access to international markets um, would further help democratize investing. Yeah, I think from the trends part, I think I'll stop there. My the one I'm most bullish on is AI driven investment advice, but I think closely followed blockchain based solutions and I think what was the third thing I said? Expanded access to international markets.
Right. Thank you for that. So let's look very briefly at the challenges. What challenges do you think that, I mean, the future growth of fintech would face in terms of the African investment space? And how do you think fintech firms can possibly address this?
So I think like the biggest challenges in within the context of like Africa, one is infrastructure gaps. Um, Internet is still not as fast as should be, although we are seeing like a lot of interesting people step into the space. But we still have a long way to go with regards to things like internet speeds, for example. Um, and people are laying like fiber. People are doing like a lot of interesting things, subsea cables, all of those things. But I think there's still a lot of work to go there. Infrastructure to even goes outside of just internet um, penetration or internet or connectivity speeds. It also goes to things like the kind of institutions we have, the kind of research um, institutions ability to do research. There are lots of things. I think when I think of infrastructure, I think very broadly, right? I don't just think of it as just internet connection or roads or hospital, any of those things. But there are gaps, huge gaps. There are regulatory too. There are complexities there. A lot of like markets in Africa, like the regulatory regimes, they are very nuanced and very complex, and they differ. If you go to like the EU region, for example, there are places in EU where, or most of EU, there are licenses that you can get, and then you can, serve customers in literally the 100% of like all of the countries in 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 Europe. Um, and we still have a long way to go with regards to that in Africa. Next door Ghana, way smaller population than Nigeria, probably 20% of or 30% of Nigeria's population, right, have their own licensing regime, which is completely different from Nigeria's. So infrastructure gaps, regulatory complexity, financial literacy too is a huge one. Probably up to 50%, or as far as I'm concerned, the numbers are even higher. Probably 70-80% of Africans are financially illiterate. So that's another massive challenge in itself. But we're trying to do our own bit in addressing some of these challenges through education, to the best that we can of our own ability, better infrastructure, and working with like the regulators to come up with better and clearer regulatory guidelines.
Thank you, Tommy. This has really been an interesting session. I typically wish we had more time. But before we go, I let's just take one question from our audience. So they would like to know, how safe is my investment and my information in the fintech space?
Yeah. So I think like it depends on the platforms, right? Platforms have different um, measures that they take. We as a platform, one of the things like we always ensure like regulatory compliance. Um, we make sure that our products are or our services are have regulatory oversight. We're licensed with like the SEC in a lot of the jurisdictions that we offer our service, right? So here in Nigeria, we have a license. Um, in other markets too as well, we have certain licenses, and in places where we don't have licenses, we only work with reputable entities, right, that are also licensed as well. Um, and not just licensed from a sec perspective, from a asset securities perspective, but at the same time also making sure like, okay, things like the cash are insured, right? So with our US products, for example, we insure people's accounts up to $500,000, right? With Nigerian products or people that put naira, for example, you have NDIC insurance or NDIC coverage, and the same thing across like some of the other jurisdictions or products that we have. So I think like super important licensing or working through license or working with licensed proxies or partners, but at the same time, um, making sure like we uphold all of the privacy guidelines that exist. In Nigeria, we're NDPR compliant. Globally, we are GDPR compliant too as well, and we do audits to make sure like everybody's information is safe. We encrypt data. We do like all of the super interesting and technical stuff to make sure there's no data breach and like everybody's data and information is safe and away from the eyes of the enemies.
Thank you. So, on the top of your head, do you maybe suggest any educational platforms or any sites or any guides customers can actually go to just to feel safe, to feel that they can trust this investment platforms?
Um, yeah, so I think with regards to like my own space is their websites that help with like education. There's Motleyfool, there's Investopedia, there are lots of podcasts and all of these things, right? With regards to like regulatory, if you want to check anything historically, most SECs, and when I say like most SECs in the globally, or whether it's Nigeria, whether it's US, whether it's UK, whether it's Ghana, wherever it is, they have data on like who their licensed entities are. So what you want to do, some companies are not licensed with the same name. So for example, you would see a company that is named ABC App, right? But their license is um, HEJ securities or HEJ brokers or whatever it is, right? So what you really want to do is you want to also go on like the regulator's website and then try to you can ask the platform, okay, you're regulated, okay, what is the name of your license, or what are you people regulated, or what's the entity that is regulated by the SEC, and you go do that check by yourself. And if they are doing partnerships, they're working with partners, um, you can also like check the exact same way. Is the partner regulated or are they directly regulated? And just go to the SEC website, in whichever jurisdiction or country or wherever your locality you are, and you could check that in a matter of minutes.
Thank you. That's interesting to know. So, leave us with your final words. What advice would you give to aspiring fintech entrepreneurs who want to make a significant impact in the investment and wealth management sector in Africa?
Um, hmm, Interesting. Um, I think my big takeaways, I think our problems in Africa are nuanced. We have very nuanced problems. And what I mean by that is our problems are unique, our challenges are unique. I think the first thing I see is a lot of people copy like Western concepts and just come to bring it to Africa. Africa has its own unique challenges. And so like it's very important to focus on like solving like real problems in Africa. Um, the POS concepts that I mentioned, POS really like the thing is everywhere, literally. At this point, I think they probably have more than 100,000 or 200,000 POS agents in Nigeria. And by POS agents, there are people that carry these small machines, and then you go there, you put your ATM card. You don't need to go to like this big ATM machine at the bank. Again, you just go to these small agents, put your card. The thing is literally the size of a phone, right? And then they give you the cash. That will not work in any Western, country. Like it won't work in the UK. It won't work in most all of Europe, or maybe most of Europe. I don't know whether there's some places it will work, but off the top of my head, it won't work in the US. It won't work in Canada. They have different product problems there, and so you have to focus on solving real problems, focus on solving African problems. You also have to ensure that your platform. I think where a lot of people miss it is like the platforms are very complicated, antiquated, old school. Make sure your platform is easy to use. Make sure it's accessible to everybody. Um, but outside of that, you have to build trust. So you have to be transparent, and then partnerships. I spoke, a couple of minutes ago about like if you don't have the ability to get a license yourself, partner with an entity that's licensed. People like building all sorts of banking products and they're not banks. They sit on top of banks. They build like a interesting, nice interface that's easy to use, and they do all the complicated stuff on the back end. Um, and they're catching a lot of scale and fire. So I think like trust is very important, transparency, partnerships. Africa is a market that's ready for innovation. Let's continue to build and create impact.
Right. So before we go, looking at your company's profile, I mean, with over 400,000 users and more than 300 billion naira in transactions, we will typically want to know, as well as our audience, tell us a little about Trove. What can we get in it, and how can we get it?
Yeah. So we are a financial services company, but financial services within the context of like wealth and investing. We pretty much build platforms, technology platforms that help like the average Joe or the average person become a lot more financially literate and become financially savvy, smarter with your money and your decision making around your money. But outside of that, too, as well, we also like provide you with the opportunities to build wealth. Like I said earlier, where historically, people, for example, to be able to invest in commercial papers, for example, commercial papers in Nigeria, for example, will give you 30% sometimes. So 30%, and in the context of like I put 100,000 naira, I make 30,000 naira, it's huge returns, and those are like very very minimal risk type of products. They're not, Ponzi schemes or any of these things. These are things that the SEC and regulators are confident with. But the problem here is to invest in those things, you need 10 million, 20 million, in a country or on a continent where, a lot of people earn, a couple of dollars a day, right? It's very difficult for people to aggregate or get that kind of, money, right? And so we build platforms that pretty much, help the average person climb up. Um, we're also like licensed, like I said, like we do a lot of things outside. So brokerage, investment advisory, and a bit of real estate too as well. But most people just know us as an app, right? That pretty much allows the average person invest in stocks, bonds, and all of that stuff.
That's really interesting, and I hope we can have you sometime again on the show to tell us more about Trove, because it seems like a very interesting platform that can help the unbanked and also help a lot of the not so high class people, because we have more of the people down there than the people up there actually. So I really hope we can have you on the show again. I would like to say thank you for joining us for this session, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Margaret. It was good chatting. And thank you, FinTech Africa team. It was a really interesting session.
All right.